introduced into RDNA 3. For one, this is an entirely separate block, not necessarily a chip, but it's basically an area of the APU on the GPU itself. So it's an entirely separate area. And it was co-designed by Microsoft as well as AMD. So this means they are not relying on RDNA 3's CU for machine learning to run for upsampling and other uses, which I'll get into in just a moment. Now, for those who do not understand what RDNA 3 does for its ML, I'll give you a very basic overview. RDNA 3 doesn't work in the same way as NVIDIA's Tensor Cores, much like RDNA 2. Instead, ML instructions are run on the shaders of the GPU. Now, very early on, there were reports that the AI cores were contained within the CU of RDNA 3, thanks to some official AMD slides, but honestly, this was not quite true. Instead, there are basically new functionality and instructions that the CU itself can handle, but AI still runs on the same shaders, albeit more efficiently and with additional support for instruction types. I'm glazing over a lot of technical details here for digestibility, but in the description I'll place some links to deeper articles if you'd like to know more. However, this is not really relevant to Sabin because instead it has an ML block, which, as I said a moment ago, I believe is integrated into the GPU, which was literally designed, among other things, to take a lower resolution input and upscale it. According to a few sources, this was not just AMD designed, but Microsoft had heavy input into this. Remember, Microsoft have been working on ML for quite some time. Even before the Series X launched, we saw direct ML demos with Forza. Now, to be clear, this would mean that the performance of the GPU wasn't impacted at all. This whole process was also automatic, so it did not require, to my understanding, a developer to do anything. They didn't need to, say, implement the upscalers such as FSR. Temporal upscalers such as FSR2 are gaining a lot of popularity right now, and the image quality is decent but not perfect. NVIDIA's DLSS, which relies on tensor cores, generally offers superior quality at lower resolutions. Now, my understanding, the specifications generally in terms of, say, compute are closer to the Series S. But again, it did feature more RAM, although I don't have the exact quantity. I don't think it actually been 100% nailed down. But the really interesting thing here is that pricing was going to be very similar to the Series S. That was the target. Basically, visuals, though, because of upsampling and other changes, would be very similar to the Series X. But ultimately, this was not really being designed as a replacement to the Series X. But I think Microsoft have put the project on hold, probably even cancelled it. And I do not believe that Microsoft are working on a pro console. I could be wrong, but to my understanding, I don't think they are. Now, why did they cancel this? Well, there were numerous reasons provided to me. Similar to the canning of the PS5 Pro, a lot of them were business decisions. The complexity of another SKU for developers to program for, the marketing efforts, and a number of other issues. Plus, of course, scalers such as FSR2 currently do exist, albeit this method is, from my understanding, superior to, say, FSR2. I also think that this project was cancelled very early. The features and rough performance targets had been decided, AMD were contacted, chip simulations had begun. Indeed, I've seen a couple of documents for that, although I can't show them unfortunately. But before Microsoft had made any actual prototype hardware or sent it out to developers. But the really exciting thing about Sabin, at least in my personal opinion, is that Sabin did have this chip, and it represents an incredibly interesting thought to what could happen to a next-generation Xbox, and indeed also Sony. Curiously, there have been some rumors in the past that Microsoft are pushing AI into Windows 12. In fact, I'd also reported that from yet another source, the next-generation Xbox, not Sabin, this would be an entirely new generation of console, likely released in 2027 or 2028, would feature a tighter integration of AI. Curiously, this would involve things like better AI in gamed characters, natural language communication, kind of like ChatGPT in some ways, and whether the Sabin chip itself could run this stuff, at least kind of in theory, I wasn't exactly told, but it does make logical sense, and besides, designs have evolved themselves. Now, how will this actually differ from later iterations of RDNA, such as RDNA 4? Now, it's too early to tell 100%. In recent interviews with 4Gamers, along with other publications, various engineers and management within AMD have hinted that they kind of want to go this route to a degree, accelerators for game AI, for example. Frankly, there's a lot of pieces and moving parts here, and I think parts of this getting reused and enhanced for new consoles is hard to say. The early leaks I've been given about RDNA 4 also point to a new ground-up design with multiple chiplet compute dies. RDNA 3 houses a single compute die known as a GCD. While GCDs 2 still exist technically with RDNA 4, the GCD itself is separated up to 3 GCXs, and each of these GCXs houses a number of CUs. Now this could change prior to launch, but it is possible, of course, my info is wrong. However, it's worth noting that some of this information I've received are some of the very same sources that leaked me the configurations of RDNA 3 for Navi 31, 32, and 33, and so far that information has bared to be 100% accurate. Speaking of which though, a Simplet source has told me that the next generation of Xbox and PS5 will use RDNA 4 as its base, with some customizations of the graphics IP. Honestly though, I have to say I'm a bit skeptical about this information. RDNA 4 launches next year on the PC, assuming AMD's own roadmaps don't slip. And RDNA 5 will be about 2 years after that, which makes it 2026. Microsoft and Sony's consoles are expected to hit shelves 2027 to 2028, according to documents anyway. Now, assuming AMD haven't moved entirely away from this GPU architecture by then, I find it very unlikely that we're going to see these consoles sport anything less than RDNA 6. Microsoft, for example, seem to want feature parity between the latest RDNA version and Xbox hardware. So I don't see this happening because obviously porting games from the PC to Xbox and vice versa is a really big step for them in terms of like the SDKs and development process. And Sony, it's the same thing. Sony have always pushed towards the latest versions with lots of customization. The PS4 Pro, for example, when it launched, it was based on Polaris and Vega. Vega had not even been available for desktop at that point. So again, I don't think RDNA 4 is likely. It could be, I could be wrong. And also, when it comes to IP versions with graphics hardware and consoles, they kind of mean less anyway because you can just do shit tons of customization across the board. Now I will say that at this stage I have no performance targets for the next generation consoles, and honestly I'd not be too hung up about this because there probably are multiple designs being worked on. There's generally like, and this is typical for Sony, Microsoft and other companies, there's generally like a couple of competing designs which are being decided upon, and then once a design is decided upon, then it needs to undergo evaluation, and then, for example, there might be cost concerns or whatever, and maybe something could get cut down, maybe they might not hit the yields necessary, whatever. I'm vastly simplifying this stuff, by the way, so it's not 100% technically accurate, but I'm trying to give you guys a rough understanding how this stuff happens behind the scenes. So, yeah, I think Microsoft and Sony are going to do a lot of custom work for, their respective consoles, assuming it is still AMD that are providing the hardware. It could be Nvidia, it could be Intel, it could be someone entirely different. But at this stage, I don't think it's very likely Microsoft, for example, are going to work with someone else. It's always possible. I'm sure these discussions happen all the time, but I'm not convinced. I think at this point, with the roadmaps that we've seen and with the conversations that we've seen publicly and the interviews and how well received the consoles have been, I don't really think it's going to be possible. Now, I want to say up front, I still think Sony and Microsoft are now squarely focused on next generation hardware. I just want to mention this in this video because I'm still being asked about the PS5 Pro because recently Tom Henderson put out a report. Now, I've covered this in a previous video, but what I want to say is that prior to Henderson's report, I'd actually put out a video myself, a couple of videos actually regarding the PS5 Pro. Now, much of Henderson's info still seems to echo my own. I could be wrong about this, but I think the PS5 Pro is dead, much like Saban. I would love to be wrong about this because I am a geek. I just want to screw around with new toys, talk about their potential, but I feel that in present market conditions and a number of other reasons, I think the PS5 Pro is likely cancelled. From what I was told, the PS5 Pro's cancellation actually happened at some point last year, possibly mid last year, but maybe a little later. I don't think development kits have taken any form of shape like the Saban architecture. And it could be misinformation that the PS5 ever existed, although given the number of sources who told me this and Henderson himself, who's had a great track record, I'm skeptical that Sony weren't at least considering it. It's possible that it is still in development, and therefore my newer information that it's cancelled is wrong. But yeah, ironically enough, a couple of sources who told me it was being worked on are now telling me it's being cancelled. I'll give you a TLDR though on what I was told initially, but it's based on RDNA 3, a custom design. We've already seen some patents regarding this. I've discussed these ad nauseum. I don't think that these patents have anything to do with the PS5 based console. It doesn't make sense. The design looks much more in line with RDNA 3-ish. I think Alex Battaglia over Digital Foundry has also said this a couple of times in public. It doesn't look like the PS5. There have also been numerous other discussions from Sony which seem to indicate that they're working on advanced ray tracing technology, including upsampling, which doesn't really fit what the PS5 can do. But getting back to that, Zen 4, again, 8 cores. Performance was around 2 times. I don't know whether that's FP32, so the T-flops if you prefer, or raster performance around 2.5 times in ray tracing. The targets were multi-bounce, ray tracing, high resolutions, but primarily it was designed as a premium VR experience for PSVR 2. Target release date was next year, likely later. Basically, the general IP seems very similar to what Microsoft were targeting with Sabin, but obviously the PS5 Pro was a lot more expensive a unit. I've heard actually this is one of the reasons it got canned, because it's probably going to cost several $100s. Sabin likely had kind of similar levels to the Xbox Series X, if this is true, but it was utilizing things like machine learning. For what it's worth, I think that this is going to be a very integral part to Sony as well. There have actually been some patents from Sony. You can dig around yourself for this, and they've been talking about improving AI for game characters and interactivity. There's a lot of, VR patents as well. So I think this is going to be a linchpin of the next generation experience. As I said earlier, ray tracing reconstruction has also been a big thing Sony have been discussing. So I think that machine learning of some description is going to be a really big deal for the next generation of consoles. AI is like all you're hearing about right now. So it doesn't take that much of a leap of faith to say, well, it's probably going to be a big deal for the next generation consoles. So yeah, I think the PS6 and the next generation Xbox will be where excitement begins again. I think it's far too early to talk about deep chats about specifications and performance targets.